When we talk about authoritarian states or dictatorships, China, Russia, and North Korea are usually the first names that come to mind. But little do most people know, one of the richest and most successful nations in the world, Singapore, is also often slapped with the semi-authoritarian label. Yes, you heard that right. A tiny island with one of the highest living standards, a booming economy, and a crime rate so low it's almost suspiciously perfect, is often described as authoritarian. How did a country like this, once resource poor and newly independent, manage to not only survive but thrive? In this video, we'll explore how the People's Action Party, PAP, and the legendary Lee Kuan Yew played a huge role in this transformation, why Singapore is often misunderstood as a dictatorship, and how the country's tight political control has become its secret weapon for success. Stick around, it's a fascinating and slightly controversial ride. The cornerstone of Singapore's success can be traced back to the founding of the People's Action Party, PAP, and the leadership of one man, Lee Kuan Yew. Now, when you think about a nation's transformation from struggling to thriving, most would probably point to some miracle. But in Singapore's case, it wasn't magic. It was the strategic brilliance and, let's be honest, the steely determination of Lee Kuan Yew. In 1965, Singapore faced a heap of challenges: a lack of natural resources, a tiny population, and an uncertain future. To put it simply, it was a small dot on the map, surrounded by much larger, far wealthier neighbors. So, what did Lee Kuan Yew do? He turned it into one of the world's most developed, prosperous, and well-managed countries in just a few decades. Talk about a comeback story. Lee, often hailed as the founding father of modern Singapore, had one laser-focused vision: a Singapore that was economically strong, politically stable, and above all, secure. The challenge, though, wasn't just about building up infrastructure or boosting the economy. It was about surviving in a world where Singapore had nothing but its people and its ability to think long-term. You see, right after Singapore gained independence from Malaysia, the situation wasn't exactly ideal. The country was left with almost no natural resources to speak of, and it was stuck with a political environment that could easily have torn it apart. The country's separation from Malaysia meant a loss of the economic support it had enjoyed. Singapore had to figure out how to create wealth, how to make it a player on the world stage, and how to unite a population that was as diverse as they come: Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others. In those early years, Lee Kuan Yew knew that survival depended on good governance. And for Lee, good governance meant having a strong hand at the helm, even if it wasn't the most popular approach. Under his leadership, the PAP didn't just dominate the political landscape, they created it. Lee's government quickly seized control of key state functions: the media, trade unions, even the education system. Now, before you start calling him a tyrant, let's break this down. Lee wasn't interested in consolidating power for the sake of ego. He understood that to achieve his vision, to make Singapore an economic powerhouse, he needed total control over the nation's policies. Centralized power meant quicker decision-making, a unified direction, and no time wasted on political squabbling. In his mind, the priority was clear: rapid economic growth and national unity. But here's the kicker. Singapore's success wasn't just built on economic policies. Lee knew that social harmony was key too. In a country where racial tensions could easily flare up, it was essential to maintain order. So Lee took a hard line on political opposition. The opposition parties in Singapore weren't exactly thriving. Many were hit with legal challenges, defamation suits, or other forms of pressure that severely limited their ability to challenge the government effectively. It wasn't a free-for-all democracy, but in Lee's eyes, it was a necessary step to keep the peace and stability in a country made up of many different ethnic and cultural groups. This is where things get interesting. While many might view Lee Kuan Yew's methods as authoritarian, it's important to understand why he took that approach. For Lee, a hands-on, pragmatic style of leadership wasn't about just holding on to power. It was about getting things done, quickly and efficiently. He had a vision, and he was determined to make it a reality. Lee famously said, "The only way to make a success of Singapore was to have an effective government that could solve problems without being impeded by political disagreements." The authoritarian label people love to throw at Singapore doesn't quite capture the full story. Yes, Lee Kuan Yew ran a tight ship, but it wasn't about suppressing people's rights just for the sake of it. His belief was that a successful, prosperous Singapore couldn't afford to be bogged down by political gridlock, which, in his view, often led to chaos and inaction. If Singapore was going to survive and thrive, it needed a government that could think and act decisively. And look at what happened. Under Lee's strict governance, Singapore achieved things that many thought impossible. Economic growth skyrocketed. The country became a global financial hub, attracting multinational companies, investors, and talent from around the world. It built one of the best public housing systems on the planet, turned its port into one of the busiest in the world, and transformed its educational system into one of the most respected in the world. Lee Kuan Yew wasn't just a politician. He was a strategist, and his brand of leadership created the bedrock upon which Singapore's prosperity stands. But let's not sugarcoat it. This approach came at a price. The political opposition in Singapore has always been weak, and there's little room for dissent. Freedom of speech? Sure, it's there, but it's tightly controlled. Public demonstrations? Not really a thing. Critics, both domestic and international, often point to Singapore's restrictions on these basic democratic freedoms as evidence of its authoritarian nature. And yes, Lee Kuan Yew's government did impose strict laws to maintain order and silence opposition. But here's the twist. It worked. Singapore didn't just survive, it thrived. And in Lee's view, that was the trade-off. Stability and prosperity in exchange for a bit less freedom in the traditional sense. Now, don't get it twisted. This wasn't some iron-fisted dictatorship. People in Singapore still had opportunities for success, a high standard of living, and personal safety. In fact, Singapore became one of the safest places to live in the world. But the country wasn't built on the ideals of a freewheeling democracy like those in the West. Instead, it was built on the back of pragmatic decision-making, centralized power, and yes, a very strong hand at the top. Lee Kuan Yew wasn't a dictator in the traditional sense. He was a visionary who understood that sometimes, to get the job done, you need to make tough decisions that don't always sit well with everyone. And through his leadership, Singapore evolved from a struggling port city into a global powerhouse, a semi-authoritarian state, if you will, that has more or less perfected the art of governance through strong centralized control. So the question isn't really whether Singapore is authoritarian or not. The question is, how many countries can say they've achieved the same kind of success? Not many. And that's exactly why, despite its political structure, Singapore stands as one of the most successful nations in the world today.